Here are 3 stories about betrayal. Please write in the comments which story you liked the most. And also don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. From the outside, their marriage looked ideal, quietly enviable even. Eliza and Daniel had built a life of structured normalcy, full of shared calendars, weekend brunches, and mutual social circles. There were no loud arguments, no dramatic disappearances, no telltale signs of a union in distress. But beneath the surface, the routine that kept their lives orderly had also dulled something vital. Eliza had begun to feel invisible, not unloved but unseen, like a well-worn page in a favorite book, familiar, comforting, and eventually overlooked. It began innocently. A lingering compliment, a message left unread for a few hours too long. Then came the late-night conversations, cloaked in vague justifications. Eliza found herself caught in a storm she didn't entirely resist. The affair wasn't explosive. It was slow-burning, built on emotional validation and the sense of being desired again. She told herself it wasn't about love, it was about feeling alive. Still, secrets are rarely sustainable. And when Daniel stumbled upon the truth, it wasn't because he was suspicious. It was because the universe handed it to him on an ordinary Tuesday morning. A phone left unlocked, a name that didn't match a contact photo, a string of messages too raw to ignore. He read each line with a growing heaviness in his chest. Not rage, not despair, just the suffocating weight of reality settling over his carefully curated life. Eliza expected fury. She anticipated shattered glass, raised voices, or at the very least, the cold, withdrawn silence of a man preparing to leave. But Daniel didn't react that way. He said nothing. For 3 days, he carried on as if the discovery had never happened. He made his coffee, folded his laundry, responded to emails, and even asked her how her day had been. His stillness, his almost eerie calm, was not a comfort, it was a warning. Because silence, in the right hands, can be more terrifying than any scream. And Daniel's silence wasn't emptiness. It was movement below the surface, thoughtful, intentional, and it was about to change everything in ways Eliza never could have imagined. Eliza moved through those days as if in a waking dream. She monitored Daniel closely, searching for cracks in the mask he wore so flawlessly. But there were none. He smiled politely, fulfilled his obligations, and never once mentioned what he had seen. She began second-guessing herself. Had he really read the messages? Had he misunderstood their meaning? But no, she knew Daniel too well. He had seen everything, and he was doing exactly what he wanted to do. Nothing. At least, not yet. Then, the changes began, almost imperceptibly at first. Daniel started waking up earlier. He took calls in another room, kept his phone face down, and returned from errands later than usual. He dressed better, subtly but deliberately. His routines shifted, his habits altered. It was as if he had begun crafting a new version of himself while leaving the old one behind, quietly shedding layers of their shared life, like an actor stepping out of costume. Eliza's unease deepened. She expected confrontation, not reinvention. She anticipated punishment, not detachment. But Daniel didn't withdraw in anger. He evolved in silence. The man she had betrayed was becoming a stranger, and she was losing her grip on what that meant. He hadn't packed a bag or slammed a door, but the house felt different, colder, less like a home, more like a waiting room for something unspeakable. The most unnerving moment came one afternoon when Eliza returned from work. Daniel had reorganized the entire guest room. It now resembled a personal studio, bookshelves, a sleek desk. A room that didn't include her. When she asked about it, he simply replied that he needed space to think. Nothing more. No blame, no sarcasm, just distance. That night, she lay awake beside him, unable to sleep. The ceiling above them felt heavier than ever. The man whose heart she had broken lay breathing steadily beside her, and yet he felt miles away. Not because he hated her, but because he had moved on from needing to respond. Whatever judgment she expected had been replaced by something far more disarming: clarity. Daniel had made a decision. It was written in his silence, etched in the precision of his movements, the subtle but undeniable shift in his energy. And soon, that decision would surface, with a force Eliza was not prepared to meet. 2 weeks passed, and Daniel's silence had become a constant, almost like background noise, ever present, shaping everything around it. Eliza began living in anticipation of a rupture that never came. Every day felt like a countdown to a bomb she couldn't see. But Daniel had no intention of exploding. His strategy was far more precise. On a Sunday morning, under a cloudless sky, Daniel asked Eliza to join him for coffee on the back patio. It was a simple gesture, and yet she knew it wasn't casual. He had never stopped inviting her to the rituals of their shared life, but this felt curated. The sun hit his features with the same warmth she used to find familiar, but now he looked sculpted by a purpose she couldn't read. He spoke calmly, as if reciting a weather report. He told her he knew everything, down to the dates, the frequency, the messages she probably assumed had vanished into digital dust. There was no venom in his voice, only precision. He explained that he had consulted with a lawyer, not to end the marriage, but to protect the assets he had built alone. She blinked in confusion. He wasn't leaving? No, that wasn't his plan. Daniel had decided to stay, but on his own terms. What Eliza didn't know was that he had already withdrawn from the shared accounts, placed the house under his name through legal maneuvering she hadn't noticed, and set up separate finances. Everything they once called ours had been unstitched behind her back, quietly and expertly. She hadn't just lost trust, she had lost position. Then came the most shocking part. Daniel told her he forgave her. Not in the way most would imagine, not with a warm embrace or a broken-hearted plea for a fresh start. His forgiveness was colder, more tactical. He would remain her husband, maintain public appearances, but emotionally, he was no longer hers. He had set her free, and caged himself no longer. He left her on that patio, with her coffee cooling in her hands, and the reality of her new life forming like frost on glass. She wasn't abandoned, she was eclipsed, by a man who didn't yell, didn't beg, didn't crumble. Instead, he rebuilt, quietly, completely. And in doing so, he became the one thing she never anticipated: unforgettable.
The wedding was nothing short of spectacular. A warm spring sun filtered through the garden trees, casting golden light across ivory flowers, and guests, dressed in shades of pastel. Everything had gone according to plan. The ceremony unfolded without a hiccup. The vows were heartfelt, and the reception sparkled with laughter and clinking glasses. It was, by all accounts, the kind of wedding people would talk about for years. For Camille, it was meant to be the start of forever. She had spent months planning every detail with precision. Each flower arrangement, each song on the playlist, each seating chart balanced to avoid drama. What she hadn't accounted for, however, was the betrayal blooming in the background like a weed under silt. James, her new husband, had looked flawless. Tailored tuxedo, confident smile, every move like a man who had it all. Camille had fallen for his charisma early on, convinced by his steady presence and charm that he was the man she could build a life with. But what she didn't realize was that James had perfected the art of performance. The version of him she loved was polished, practiced, and far from complete. The guests began to trickle out just after midnight, tipsy and joyful, leaving behind a trail of confetti and half-eaten cake. Camille had gone upstairs first, still glowing from the celebrations, still believing the night would end in romantic bliss. She changed out of her dress and waited. Minutes turned into a strange stretch of time that felt too long for a groom who had just married the love of his life. Curiosity gave way to unease. When she descended the staircase, barefoot and quiet, she followed the sound of hushed voices and muffled laughter. Not coming from the kitchen or the sitting room, but from the back hallway near the guest bedrooms, a hallway they had agreed would be off limits for the night. What she saw next would unravel everything. There, in a corner of shadows and soft lamplight, was James, not alone, not innocent. The moment was swift and sharp, like a slap in the dark. Camille's world, once carefully ordered and hopeful, shattered in an instant, right there on the night that was supposed to be the foundation of a new life. Camille froze, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and panic. What she had witnessed couldn't be unwitnessed. James, her husband of mere hours, stood locked in an intimate moment with someone she had known her entire life, her cousin, Leela, the woman who had smiled through every wedding photo, toasted with charm, and hugged Camille as if the bond between them were sacred. The image seared into Camille's mind like a cruel photograph. It wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation laced with audacity. On their wedding night, in the home of her childhood, surrounded by people who trusted in their love, James had torn through the sanctity of everything they had promised just hours before. And Lila, she had crossed a line, so deep, it echoed through generations of shared memories. Camille didn't scream. She didn't speak. She turned. Each step back to the master bedroom felt heavier than the last, her heart pounding not with sorrow, but with a stunned silence that bordered on numbness. She closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and waited, not for answers, those would come too late, but for the strength to decide what came next. James appeared 15 minutes later, disheveled but composed. He didn't speak of what happened. He offered no excuses, no confession. Instead, he crawled into bed beside Camille, as if nothing had changed, as if they had just returned from their honeymoon suite. But everything had changed. A fracture had opened between them, invisible yet unbridgeable, and it would grow with each passing second of silence. The morning came quickly. Guests filled the dining room for a farewell brunch, unaware of the storm that had already taken place. Camille dressed in white again, her face unreadable, her movements methodical. She poured mimosas, took photos, and smiled when spoken to. To the outside world, she was a radiant newlywed. Inside, she was collapsing under the weight of a secret too vile to share. And James played his part, flawlessly. The devoted husband, the attentive son-in-law, the perfect host. But Camille knew. She had seen who he truly was. Behind the vows, behind the suit, behind the mask. And while she hadn't spoken a word, the silence between them had begun to speak volumes. The days that followed were an exquisite form of torment. Every glance, every gesture from James, a calculated echo of the man she once believed in. Camille moved through the motions like an actress trapped in a script she hadn't written. Their honeymoon plans were postponed under the guise of family matters, a convenient lie to give her time to think. But thinking only led her deeper into the truth. Each time she looked at him, she didn't see the groom who once held her hand at the altar. She saw a traitor in disguise, smiling for photos and whispering apologies she would never hear. James had not only betrayed her heart, he had humiliated her in the presence of family. And Lila, once a sister in spirit, had become a symbol of every cruel deception ever committed in the name of love. Camille gathered evidence quietly. She traced back conversations, moments she had brushed aside, late-night texts, suspicious delays, glances she had once written off as innocent. It had all been there, hiding in plain sight, covered by layers of charm and trust. What hurt most was not just the infidelity, it was how carefully it had been concealed, as though her intelligence, her worth, had never mattered at all. On the 7th day, Camille acted. There was no confrontation, no explosive scene. Instead, she left a note. Not for him, but for herself. A reminder that the girl who had entered that wedding was not the same woman who would walk away from it. She packed only what she needed, left her ring on the kitchen table, and disappeared before the sun rose. She didn't go home. She went forward, to a place James wouldn't expect, where she could begin rebuilding the foundation he had so swiftly destroyed. And as the scandal slowly trickled through the family, fueled by whispers and careful omissions, Camille remained silent. She didn't need to explain. The truth had already begun its quiet march through the cracks he had made. James was left with his image, his lies, and the memory of a wedding that had turned to ash before the cake had even settled. And Camille, she would become a woman unbroken, reborn not from love, but from the fire of betrayal survive.
To those around them, Natalie and Marcus were the definition of stability. A home nestled in the suburbs, 2 children enrolled in good schools, holiday cards sent every December without fail. Their marriage appeared solid, built on shared responsibilities and mutual respect. Friends admired how seamlessly they functioned. Natalie, the efficient mother and part-time consultant. Marcus, the dependable project manager with a mild sense of humor and steady hands. There were no raised voices, no dramatic disappearances, no stories of scandal. Their life unfolded in calm, predictable rhythms. Weeknight dinners, PTA meetings, weekend soccer games. But Marcus never noticed how quietly Natalie had slipped away from him, not in body, but in spirit. She was present, yes, but only partially. A gaze that drifted too often, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The signs were there, but subtle, veiled in routine and comfort. Marcus worked long hours, often returning home after the children were in bed. He never questioned Natalie's schedule, her occasional weekend retreats, her dinners with old friends, her freelance gigs that required hotel stays. None of it seemed unusual in their world. They trusted each other, or at least, he trusted her. But Natalie was not living the life she claimed. Beneath the surface of her well-ordered world was a second existence, one built carefully and quietly over years. It began innocently, with online forums and private messages. Then came the in-person meetings, the trips that weren't for work, and the name she used when no one from her real life was listening. She had built a parallel reality, one where she was free of roles, labels, and expectations, a version of herself unburdened by family, untouched by vows. And yet, she never planned to leave. That was never the goal. The thrill wasn't in escaping, it was in managing both lives without them colliding. She found purpose in the secrecy, power in the control. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, eventually drift to the surface. And when Marcus discovered a single misplaced envelope, addressed not to Natalie, but to the name she used in her other life, his world tilted. He didn't open it immediately. He studied the handwriting, the unfamiliar return address, and the date. Then he set it down, the weight of it heavier than any truth he had ever known. The life he thought he shared with his wife was no longer just theirs, and he was about to find out how little he truly knew. Marcus waited 3 days before confronting the envelope again. He hid it in his drawer, beneath old receipts and forgotten warranties, yet it haunted him. Natalie had no idea he'd found it. She continued as usual, pouring his coffee in the morning, scrolling through her phone at night, tucking their children into bed with the same affection she always showed. But to Marcus, every smile became suspect. Every glance, every moment of silence carried a new, weighty meaning. He eventually opened it, carefully, as though touching something fragile and dangerous. Inside was a letter. Not a business document or some mundane receipt, as he had hoped, but something far more personal, passionate, handwritten, and unmistakably intimate. It was addressed to Claire, the name Natalie used when she stepped outside of their shared life. The writer described moments they had spent together, expressed longing, and hinted at a future that Marcus had never been invited into. There was no anger in Marcus at first, just a deep, quiet unraveling. He traced the timeline in his head, trying to find the moment she had changed, the moment he had missed. And the more he searched, the more he realized she hadn't changed suddenly. She had evolved slowly, right before his eyes. Her secret life wasn't a recent creation. It had roots. It had routine. He hired someone, discreetly. He needed more than a letter. He needed clarity, proof. What he uncovered turned suspicion into certainty. Natalie had another apartment under a different name. It was modest, hidden in a neighborhood they never visited. There, she met someone regularly. The man, unknown to Marcus, was divorced, worked in publishing, and appeared to have no idea she was married. In that space, Natalie was someone else entirely. She laughed more, lingered longer, lived freer. Marcus stood outside that building one cold afternoon, watching as his wife exited in clothes he hadn't seen before, with an expression he hadn't witnessed in years. She was glowing, not with guilt, but with liberation. He didn't confront her, not yet. He needed to understand how a life so carefully constructed could hold something so drastically hidden. At home, Natalie kissed him on the cheek like always. She asked about his day and complimented the dinner he reheated. But the ground beneath them was shifting, and Marcus knew. The illusion was crumbling. The woman he married was no longer entirely his, and she hadn't been for a very long time. Marcus had never believed himself the type to be deceived. He prided himself on perception, on instinct. And yet, Natalie had kept an entire life tucked neatly within the seams of their marriage, hidden not through cunning, but through familiarity. She had been both devoted wife and distant stranger, and Marcus had loved them both without realizing they were not the same woman. The confrontation didn't come in a storm of raised voices or shattered dishes. It came in the form of calm. One evening, Marcus asked Natalie to sit down. He didn't accuse her. He simply placed the letter on the table. Her face didn't crumble. She didn't panic. Instead, she blinked, once, and then breathed, deeply, as though the weight she had carried had finally been set down. She didn't deny it. She didn't try to explain it away. She only said that she had needed something that Marcus had stopped giving her years ago. Not love, not money, but space to exist as more than just mother, wife, caretaker. The other life, she admitted, wasn't just an escape. It was her. The version of herself that hadn't vanished in laundry cycles and school calendars. The part she had buried when she chose a life that looked right from the outside but never quite fit within. Marcus listened, not because he understood, but because he had to. For the sake of closure, for the sake of knowing whether the life they built had meant anything at all. Natalie cried, but not from guilt, from mourning. She knew the truth would end everything, and yet she seemed almost relieved. They agreed to separate without drama, not because they didn't care, but because too much had already been broken. Telling the children was the hardest part. Camille and Noah were too young to grasp the intricacies of betrayal, but old enough to feel the shift in the air. Marcus told them enough to be honest without being cruel. Natalie, for once, had no words. Weeks later, as papers were signed and homes divided, Marcus stood in the bedroom they had once shared. It no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a stage set that had finally been struck, exposing the scaffolding behind every scene they had played. And somewhere beyond the ruins of what they once were, Natalie walked away, not as a villain, but as a woman who had dared to live fully, at the cost of everything.